the seat taken? Hey, shh. Keep your voice down. People trying to sleep. Your first voyage. Might be your last. The storm keeps up. I'm only joking. Captain's fared through worse. I've served on this ship 18 years. 5 of those as first officer. We've only capsized twice. Well, as first officer, it's my job to welcome all the new swabbies to the crew. So, what brings you to this life of crime? Debt to the crown you can't pay. A life of crime on the high seas or debtor's prison to rot. All too common. Tell me, do you hold a grudge against the crown? So do I, and at least half the crew aboard this tub. Though none more than our captain. He never told me why he hates the crown so much. But I met a man, an old soldier of fortune, said he knew the captain's story. Say, since there's nothing to do in this storm, would you like to hear a story? Wonderful. The old soldier of fortune. He says the captain was the captain of a royal ship, pride of the fleet. He fought the Barbary Empire for the crown. Decorated soldier, full crew, full pension. But one day out at sea, he gets a message. His baby, daughter, she's gravely ill. He begged and pleaded with the admiral to let him go home and see them. But they couldn't lose a ship, and so the admiral refused. He tried to turn the ship around himself, but the first officer wanted his job. Good little servants of the crown, his crew threw him in the brig. By the time he made it back to port, his daughter had passed on from consumption, and his wife soon after from grief. He blamed the crown and the crew of yes-men for never being able to see them again, especially his first mate. So early in the night, while his crew slept, he piled barrels of cannon powder below deck and struck a long, long fuse. While it burned, he went into town and tried to enter the admiral's villa, on official business, of course. But the guards refused. Moments later, with a crack, his ship in the harbor was splintered into kindling and fire. The sound so loud it shook the port awake, including the dear admiral, who rushed out of his house to find the captain with his saber drawn. Before he could call for help, the captain ran him through. A life for a life. Of course they caught him, threw him into jail to be hanged at daybreak for his crimes. But one of the other prisoners, a deserter, recognized him and heard what he had done. They escaped, stole a ship, and vowed so long as the king ruled these waters, no one would be safe. Based on what he had done, he earned the name Black Powder Pete. But that's a bit long, so we just call him Captain Pete Black. Or so the story goes. Here. A toast to the captain. What was that? You want to know my story? It's a story I never get tired of telling. I was born in a debtor's prison to a whore and a god. When I was small, I spent my first years scrubbing the mortuary ovens. When I got too big to sweep the ovens, they sent me to the roof at night to sweep the chimneys. Well, all the fires were out, of course. Now everyone in the prison knew the man named Bloody Eddie on account of his crimes. Spent his whole life locked away in the basement. He was as mad as they come, but his silver tongue could sell a life of sin to the Pope. Everyone knew not to talk to him, lest they be convinced to set him free. But one day, an assistant to the doctors found himself in the pitch black, took a wrong turn looking for the toilet, found himself in the basement, in Eddie's grasp. Convinced him to open the door, just for a second. And that's all it took. Eddie was out with the whole prison sleeping. Well, everyone except me, of course. Any other crazy would have escaped while they had the chance, but Eddie wasn't like any other crazy. He doused all the linens he could find in grease from the kitchen and set the prison ablaze. I saw the smoke from the roof and tried to warn everyone, but the fire moved too quickly between the waxed timbers. Almost no one got out alive, not even Bloody Eddie. When the fire had died down and the coppers had shown up to count the dead, I slipped out in the commotion. Made my way as far as I could until I collapsed on the side of the road. Got picked up by some gypsies. Good bunch of scum they were. They taught me scams, how to fight, thieving of all kinds. I got good at fighting. So good at nights we would hold bare-knuckle brawls in basements and back alleys and challenge the best fighters in whatever town we were in. The townsfolk would bet on the fight. I would feign and wobble on my legs, let the fighter get some good hits in, maybe get a bit bloody. Then just when the fight was all but a victory for the town's favorite, I would knock him senseless and collect our winnings. Didn't make us popular amongst the town folks, but we were always gone by morning, with their money safely stashed. Lived with them for a few years, going from town to town, running scams in the day, fighting at night, learning the trade, but it was too good to last. Gypsy King passed on, and his eldest became king. He was not half the man his father was, had no idea how to lead his people. Slowly he became drunk with power, started exiling those who would question him. Wasn't long before someone took action. After that, his brothers and sisters claimed rightful throne. Nobody could agree on who should lead, so the clan fought and fractured. We tried to hold out, a little band, hold it all together, but the spite ran deep between the factions, so it wasn't long before our camp got ratted out and the lawmen came for us. I was not about to go back to the clank, so I ran again. Found myself in a little coastal town, begging, running scams, petty theft, whatever I could to stay alive. One day, a big ship pulls into port, her captain and crew, fresh from a bounty with gold to spend. I naively thought they'd be an easy mark, especially with a few drinks in them. So I waited outside the tavern. First person out was the captain. I pretended to be drunk and stumbled into him, checking his pockets for valuables all the while. Pulled out a big gold coin. Took it to the merchant the next day, sold it for 6 silver pieces. But soon after, the captain and crew cornered me, trying to pickpocket another sailor. The captain demanded I return what I stole, so I just played the fool, and his crew came after me. Fought off most of them, swords and all, but they got the better of me in the end. Drugged me off to the ship, threw me in the brig. I was convinced it would be the end for me, but after a day or so, the captain paid me a visit. He said, I should kill you, but you fight like you have nothing to lose. And killing you would only do you a favor, so I'm giving you a choice. Work for me 2 years to pay back what you stole, or take your chances overboard. And I've been here ever since. Jeez. Days like today where there's nothing to do except drink and tell old stories. Consider yourself lucky, Swabby. Most people's first days, they're scrubbing the deck.
Tell the one about the cursed cove.
Hey, you still awake over there, old man?
Can't sleep with this bloody thunder.
So what do you say, Swabby? Cursed Cove? All right. Let's see. It was about 6 years ago now. We spent some time around Siam. The ports were bustling with business, all of it illegal, right up our alley. Heard from a guy in the port about a hidden cove full of treasure. Couldn't give us a location, just pointed us in a direction. For 5 days we scoured the coast without a trace of the hidden entrance. We were getting close to giving up when out of the fog one early morning sailed a small wicker raft with one man on board, who looked almost more fish than man. The captain called overboard asking if the man knew anything about a secret entrance. The man spoke in a raspy and crude tone. He said, "Dusk between the fingers, green hair falls golden light." The captain looked to us. Nobody knew what he was talking about, but when we looked back overboard for the man, he had vanished. We sailed for another day trying to make sense of the riddle, but then I saw something as the sun was setting. Against the cliff face of the island we were sailing, 2 pillars of stone rose out of the water. In between them, vines from the forest above hung down. I wouldn't have even seen it, but at sunset, the light shone through the vines and reflected off the ocean of brilliant gold. Dusk between fingers, green hair falls, golden light. When we got close, it was obvious there was a path hidden underneath the vines. But our ship was far too wide to sail between the fingers, so we took the skiff and 6 men, myself and the first mate included. The cove was long and treacherous. It narrowed so small the skiff could nearly not fit. But then it opened to a lake surrounded on all sides with sheer cliffs, except one which had a dock leading into a cave. Hundreds of wicker rafts piled around the area, and torches still lit, but not a soul in sight. We sailed up to the dock and stepped out. As we walked into the cave, we could see grass huts, fires still smoldering, the fish on the racks, but still no people. Some of the sailors began to lose their nerve, but the first mate silenced the descent when we looked closer on the walls to see pure gold had been inlaid into the stone, just in incredible patterns. The deeper we walked, the more gold adorned the walls, along with various items of the modern world, eye scopes, sextants, pieces of fabric and clothing. Had we not been so blinded by the gold, we may have seen the warnings. Soon we started hearing a muffled chant and drums. The sound got louder and louder the farther we walked. We could see a light in the tunnel opened into a grand chamber. Hundreds of people sat around a mound of gold, and atop the mound a man dressed head to toe in fur and jewelry. They were all entranced in the motions and the chant of the drums, but suddenly the man in the center opened his eyes and stared directly at us. The drumming and chanting stopped in an instant, and all eyes in the room slowly fell on us. We didn't know what to do. Then the man raised his hand and pointed at us, unleashing an ear-curdling scream. Had the first mate not grabbed my shirt and pulled me into a run, I would have stood there dumbfounded. We sprinted as fast as we could out of that cave, with the whole of the village chasing us, screaming all the while. We got back to the skiff in the nick of time and cast off just as the first spears flew overhead. We rode like the wind through the canyon with hundreds of wicker rafts only feet behind us. The first officer had his sword drawn, battling anyone who managed to grab the boat. We made it out between the fingers and saw the ship anchored waiting for us. First mate frantically waved his hands, screaming, "They're after us, they're after us." Taking the hint, the captain and crew loaded the 10-pounder and gave the entrance a shot, just as the rafts began to emerge, but the ball flew true, struck one of the fingers, and down it came in between the two, sealing the entrance. I almost didn't escape with my life, let alone any treasure. But man, that pile of gold. One day I'd love to go back there. How about another story? You ever hear the one about the Caribbean smugglers?
Yep.
Well, of course you heard it. You were there, big man. I was talking to the Swabby. Anyway, a couple of years back, we were escorting some cartographers around. Closest thing to honest work I've done yet. Anyway, the pay was good. All we had to do was keep these two blokes and their gear safe while we sailed around the Caribbean islands. These scholarly types were doing some kind of mapping of the islands. Came on board with chests upon chests of tools and equipment. I mean, a lot of stuff. They set up on the cannon deck and practically took over the whole bloody thing. Well, anyway, aside from the space they kept to themselves, not much for conversation.
They spoke a different language.
Did they? Well, that actually makes a lot of sense. Anyway, 2 months go by, not even so much as a whiff of trouble. The fellas finished their work, so we sailed them back to their docks, and they're met by some other bloke. Calls himself the Emperor's Dow or Zhao or whatever. Fancy son of a bitch. Commissioned the whole expedition or something. He says we were the second boat commissioned, and the first boat had disappeared. He would pay us handsomely to go find it. So, who are we to turn up a perfectly good job? So, the guy told us where the other boat went, and we headed off in that direction. Started following the other crew's footsteps. About a week later, our leads are running dry. We're low on supplies. All of a sudden, we see a plank floating in the ocean. Then a cap. Then what looks like personal effects. Then an oil slick. All hallmarks of a battle at sea. So, we loaded our cannons and sailed ready for a fight. After all, we wouldn't get paid if we couldn't find proof it was the other ship that went down. So there we were, sailing with our sabers drawn, following the trail of destruction. Then one early morning, all of a sudden, our outlook shouts from the crow's nest. Through the mist of the early day, he could see a ship. We get a little bit closer, not a ship, a shipwreck in the shallow water of a reef, but something doesn't feel right, or more specifically, doesn't smell right. The sharp smell of sulfur. Even though we can see the ship in the distance, I can feel something wrong, and so can the captain. We raise our sails and look at the ship from a distance. Quickly we discovered what was setting us uneasy. The water around our ship was hot to the touch, and the closer we sailed to that island, the hotter the water got. And the seals on our ship were melting away as we spoke. In fact, that oil slick we'd been seeing for the last 2 days was from our ship. Immediately we sailed out into the ocean until the island was but a speck on the horizon and the water was now only warm. But we still had a job to do. The captain wanted to go, but I argued his place was on the ship, so he sent me and a couple of unlucky sailors to go get proof. we put as much cloth and chaff as we could in the bottom of the skiff, and we rowed. Captain figured the skiff would be safe because it was made with joined wood, not sealed with pitch, and he was right, but my word, it was unpleasant. Hot and stinking. It took 2 hours to row one way, and the closer we got, the worse it smelled. When we got close enough to the boat, the water was nearly boiling. A single drop splashed from the oars landed on one of the sailor's legs, and he cried out in pain. The ship was almost completely underwater, with only the stern still above. It looked like it had drifted for a while and settled on the reef near the island. Only thing I could see to grab as proof was the lantern at the very, very stern of the boat. Now, all the way up in the air, we got as close as we could, and I jumped over. The wood was slippery and hot as hell, so I grabbed the railing and climbed up as far as I could, knowing that if I slipped, the only thing to slow my fall was the boiling ocean below. Up and up I climbed until I was so close I could just about touch it when a hand grabbed my ankle. I spun around to see what was a man, nearly naked, thin as a twig, and red from head to toe from the heat. He was leaning up against the wheel stand trying to speak, but not a sound came from his mouth. I will never forget his face as long as I live. I grabbed the lantern and tied it to my waist, then grabbed the man and helped him into the skiff. When we finally got back to the ship, with the lantern and the strange man, we set sail for port. Nobody thought he was going to survive, myself included, but after sleeping for 3 days straight, he was able to speak in hushed whispers. Turns out he was the captain of the sunken vessel. Their waxed hull started to melt, but nobody noticed until they started taking on water. Their only hope was to sail for shore, but the heat was too great, and they began to sink. Some of his crew and the 2 cartographers got off on skiffs, but a lot did not, and I'm sure you could guess their fate. The captain was sitting there, boiling alive against the wheel stand for 8 days before we got there. Every moment he thought his boat would slide off the reef into the boiling depths. Well, when we got back to port, the captain of the ship reported his findings to Dow or whatever, directly, along with the lantern. Dow immediately formed a fleet to go investigate the island. Turns out one of the cartographers was his son. He paid us handsomely and offered to double that if we went back, but when we inspected our hull, nearly all the bitumen had melted away. Had we not stopped, we would have met a similar fate to the other crew. Sure makes you think about how close we are to the end. All right, one more story. How about the story of how I became first mate? It is a good one. You remember when I told you the story of the captain? The deserter he broke out with? Well, that was his first mate before me. Solid bloke, even for a pirate, but like everyone, he had a weakness. Riches. From a pence to a gold pound, he could not control himself. If there was money to be taken, he would, and all of it. One day we captured a ship, small little thing, something we would pass up normally, but we were going on 5 months with not a dime to our names. The crew, mostly fishermen, were scared out of their boots and had nothing worth taking. But one of the old fishers, ratty and wild looking like he lived on his boat, told us if we let them go, he would tell us where to find all the riches we could carry. We were going to let them on their way anyway. After all, we weren't going to waste a good cannonball sinking a dinghy. So the old fisherman told us of an island, not but a day's sail from here, where deep in the forest was a tribe who worshipped these cut stones and had more than enough to share. To prove it, he pulled a huge gem out of his pocket, cut and clear as the Caribbean waters. One of the boys, a fellow named Tom, snatched it from his hand and stuffed it in his pocket. True to our word, we let the fishers go. We sailed in the direction the fishes told us to go, and sure enough, an island rose out of the horizon, covered in trees and thick fog. The island smelled of death, but nothing was going to stop us from having to look around. As we piled off the boat, swords drawn, we made our way into the island, but the second Tom stepped off the boat, his feet touched the water. A shark lunged out of nowhere, snapped Tom, dragged him into the deep. That should have been our first clue that something was wrong, but we were hungry for gold and treasure. Nothing could have convinced us to turn around now. We cut our way through the jungle until we found a tribe deep in the forest. We were expecting a fight, but the tribe went about their daily business like we were ghosts, tanning leather, drying fish, and occasionally the sight of a large jewel perched upon an altar. Carefully we walked through them, waiting for something to change and the whole place to jump us. Then a woman softly walked up to the captain. She was carrying a massive jewel on a crude pillow between her arms. She looked at him and said, "Why have you come?" Nobody knew what to say, but the first mate replied, "For treasure." The woman looked confused, so the first officer pointed to the gem in her arms. The woman nodded softly and turned to walk away, beckoning us to follow. She led us to a stone tower in the middle of her village. At the top, stacks and stacks of beautifully cut stones. She turned and said, "Take what you will, but please don't hurt my people." Quickly, everyone began filling their pockets with whatever they could grab, myself included, but the first mate had his eyes on something else. At the center of the room stood 3 pillars about waist high, and on top of 2 of them sat the largest and most beautiful gems I had ever seen, nearly identical to the one the woman was carrying. Drawn to their beauty, the first mate began to reach out his hand to grab one, but froze when the woman said, "I can't stop you from taking those, but I must warn you, they are evil. If they're cursed, then why are they on pedestals?" She smiled softly and spoke again, "To keep them away from the others." A brief hesitation gave way to a hearty laugh as he grabbed the first one and tossed it to a sailor who dropped it out of fear. He laughed even harder. "What do you believe in curses? There's nothing but bounty here." The sailor picked up the gem and chuckled before putting it in his pocket. First officer then picked up the other one, placed it in his own pocket, and the final one, perched upon the woman's pillow, he snatched with a sneer and gave to me. After we filled our pockets, we began walking back to the ship. I was among the last to go. The woman grabbed my arm as I was leaving. She looked me dead in the eyes and said, "If you leave this place with that which you hold, you will never be allowed to return to land again. It craves the soul of man more than anything." The sailor who was given the stone heard her words and turned to me with a look of despair, along with a few other sailors. I didn't want to look weak in front of my juniors or my crew, so I shook her off and walked to meet my crew. As we sailed away, the ship was alive with song and drink. I told the captain and the first mate what the woman told me, and we all laughed. We thought it was the greatest joke of all time. After all, we had a bounty that would surely buy us whatever our hearts desired as soon as we made land. The woman's words slowly disappeared from my mind. Not 5 days later, we pulled into port. However, all the gems we collected had changed. What was once clear and cut, they were now black and brittle as coal, all except for the 3 from the pedestals. The young sailor was ecstatic that he still had one precious gem to sell, so the moment we tied the docking lines, he was out and running towards the trader, but he didn't get 10 steps on land when a crane hoisting sacks of grain into a nearby boat lost its pallet, crushed him dead. Seeing this, the woman's words rang through my head. I froze in my tracks. The first mate, too, saw what happened, told the captain. We cast off then and there back to where we came from for answers. In fear, I cast my stone into the ocean, but first mate was too stubborn. He demanded answers and threatened if the woman wouldn't give it to him, he'd personally burn down the forest around them. But 3 days later, the first mate was bedridden, his eyes black as coal, his body hot to the touch. I didn't see it happen, but on the fourth day, in the pitch black of night, he stood up on his own feet and left the barracks. Some of the men tried to stop him, but he was too hot. He couldn't be touched. Against their protests, he threw himself into the ocean and was never seen again. That morning, with the island on the horizon, we dropped anchor. The captain asked where my gem was, but I reassured him it was gone. My story was backed up by the sailors who saw me do it, but the captain pointed to a lump in my pocket, asked me what was in it. It was the gem. This gem. Again, I threw it into the ocean. But no matter how much I did not want it, I was not sure it would leave me. We discussed going back to the island, getting some answers, but seeing what happened to the sailor and the first mate, we turned around, sailed off, and never spoke about the island again. No matter what I do, cast it into the ocean, smash it into dust, this gem finds its way back into my pocket. I have not left the ship in 5 years, and yet still, some nights when I sleep, I can feel it calling me back to the island where I got it. Perhaps it's trying to trick me into getting off the ship. Or maybe it just wants to be seated on the pillar like the others. Either way, it's just a matter of time before I go back. I only hope it's under my free will. So what do you think, Swabby? Is it a pirate's life for you? Well, get some rest then. As soon as the storm breaks, you'll have a lot of cleaning to do. What's that? Of course it's all true. Would I lie to you? All right then. Take it. If I was lying, this would just be a regular gem. That's what I thought. Sleep well.